The best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction.
The core idea that I understood from your book is that there's this thing that's opposite to being distracted, which is called traction, not being focused. And as a pendulum to that, it goes from being distracted to having more traction when you're swayed by external and internal triggers. So can you talk a little bit about that? And kind of like, I know it goes back to your personal responsibility, kind of like people blaming the external ones, but how are those? How is the balance between those, and how do they work, and why should
So if we think about what is distraction, the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. Traction and distraction, actually the Latin root is the same. It's trahare, which means to pull. And they both end, you'll notice, in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction is any action that pulls us towards what we want to do, things that we do with intent. The opposite of traction is distraction, anything that pulls us away from what we plan to do. So why is this important? 2 reasons. Number 1, anything can be a distraction. If you sit down at your desk like I used to do and say, okay, now I'm going to work on that big project. Now I'm finally going to focus. Now I'm finally going to finish that thing I said I was going to finish that I've been procrastinating. Right after I check email, right? Right after I check that Slack channel, right after I Google this quick thing, it feels worky, right? It feels like something that is productive to do. But if it's not what you plan to do, it is just as much of a distraction. In fact, those type of distractions are more sinister because it's not obvious that they are distractions. If you sit down and you start watching YouTube videos, well, that's clearly a distraction, right? If you're playing video games or comic books, okay, that's clearly a distraction. But if you're checking email when you said you would work on that big project, that is also a distraction. But you don't realize it's a distraction because it feels like work, right? It feels like it's productive. So anything can be a distraction, and anything can be traction. So if you want to play video games on your schedule and it's according to your values, there's nothing wrong with it. Why is playing a video game any different? Why is it worse than watching football on TV? What's the difference? There's no difference. It's just a pastime. The idea here is that you can do anything you want. I'm not going to tell you not to check Facebook or not to watch YouTube videos, or whatever you want to do is fine, as long as you do it on your schedule, not on somebody else's schedule. Do it according to your values, not according to someone else's values. So you got traction, you got distraction. Now, what pulls us towards traction or distraction is 2 things, 2 types of triggers. External triggers are the pings, the dings, the rings, all of these things in our environment that tell us what to do next with something outside of us. Now, those are the usual suspects. That's what people tend to blame when it comes to distraction. They blame the external factors. But it turns out that most distraction doesn't start outside of us. It starts within us. And this is what we call the internal triggers. So the reason that we do everything and anything is for one reason: to escape discomfort. Everything you do is about escaping discomfort, which means that time management is pain management. And so if we are to manage distraction, if we are to do what we say we're going to do, we have to find ways to make sure that we don't fall down this trap of whenever we feel lonely, uncertain, fatigued, tired, right? Well, whatever the case might be, our reflex, our habit is to turn to something to pacify these uncomfortable sensations. Instead, what we want to do is to harness those uncomfortable states to lead us towards acts of traction rather than distraction.